Hello. For a few moments here, I want to talk a little bit about the mixed history of the relationship between science and faith. Of course, science is a fairly, at least in its modern form, is a fairly recent phenomenon. True, there are people like Archimedes in the ancient world, Galen, the physician. So, I mean, there have always been people who've done sciencey things in the ancient world, and there were philosophers of science of a sort, very primitive sort. Thales, who suggested that the universe was made out of water, and so forth. Empedocles, earth, air, fire, water. Heraclitus, where you've got fire, constant, change and turmoil. Democritus, everything is made out of atoms. I mean, those are sciencey things, but modern science really dates to the last 500 years or so. There was nothing. I mean, I know we like to say that there's nothing new under the sun, and that's a proverb, right? It's in Ecclesiastes. There is a sense in which there's nothing new under the sun, but science, this did not exist in the Bible. Okay, there are no cell phones in the Bible. There is something new under the sun in the way that the world is packaged. And so modern science really arose in the last 500 years or so, and it has accelerated. In the 1800s, it accelerated well beyond anything that had happened before. And in the 20th century, in the 1900s, it accelerated well beyond anything before that. It is undeniable that there is a massive acceleration of science and understanding beyond anything that could have been imagined. And so when we talk about the birth of modern science, it seemed to me that Copernicus was a good place to start. Of course, Copernicus lived in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and Copernicus is, of course, known for suggesting that instead of the sun going around the earth, that in fact the earth went around the sun. And the key here is mathematical simplicity. There were, in fact, better formulations of the movements of the planets I'll call them the Ptolemaic scientists before him, following a more Aristotelian view of the universe. The Ptolemaic scientists actually could explain the movements of the planets more precisely than Copernicus could. Copernicus is and the reason is because Copernicus assumed that the planets and the sun, that the planets moved around the sun in circular orbits. But the reason why the Ptolemaic mathematics of explaining the movement of the planets, the reason why it worked better is because of incredibly complex mathematics, circles within circles, and so forth. So although Copernicus's explanation was not as precisely equivalent as the Ptolemaic science, it was a much simpler explanation. He could explain most of the movement of the planets with a much simpler mathematical approach, assuming that the Earth went around the sun, than that the sun went around the Earth. Of course, Johannes Kepler, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, by suggesting that the planets move around the sun in ellipses, ovals, rather than circles, worked out the math. And now we had both a simpler model explaining the movement of the planets, both simpler and precise. And so that would win the day eventually. And so this is where really the birth of modern science comes about. Now, somewhere in here, we need to mention Francis Bacon in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Francis Bacon was a champion of observation. So science was not done primarily by observation prior. I mean, this is difficult for us to imagine that you would have science that was not driven by observation. But prior to Bacon, science was primarily deductive. So we could speak of theology as the queen of the sciences, and science, you could do science in your head, basically, um, thinking about the universe and so forth. Bacon suggested that science should be done inductively, that we should go out, make observations, and that now he was a little bit naive in terms of philosophy of science, because he assumed that you could collect observations without some sort of a framework to collect or hypothesize about those observations. Science is not just a matter of the observations. Science is also a matter of how you channel those observations or funnel those observations. There's always an imaginative element to science as well. A hypothesis is involved. You collect the observations and then you hypothesize how those observations might best be processed and grouped and collected. And of course, your prior assumptions affect where you go looking for those observations as well. But definitely with Francis Bacon, we have a movement forward in science, in that he orients things toward what we're observing and not just a matter of what you're doing in your head. All of these forces come together with Galileo Galilei, who lived again in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Galileo combined the mathematical precision of a Johannes Kepler and the mathematical simplicity of a Copernicus with the observational orientation of a Francis Bacon. And so sometimes Galileo is called the father of modern science because of this combination of inductive method with mathematical precision. So this is a new moment, really, in the history of the world. It's not that some of this hasn't been done prior to the 1500s, but it's never been done quite in this way. And Galileo and these scientists will set up the world for the rise of science in a way that has happened in the last 500 years and that had never happened prior. There's a change, a qualitative change in the science that takes place after these gentlemen within this century. Well, of course, the first big conflict between modern science and faith came with Galileo. With Galileo came the first real head-on-head between science and the church. And I mean, there's a scriptural element here, in that there are scriptures that none of us today take literally. So when we read that the sun stood still, we don't take that as evidence of the sun literally going around the earth. We take that as a figure of speech. The sun appeared to stand still. It's what we call a phenomenological perspective. From the standpoint of you on the ground, it looked like the sun stood still. That we would now say, well, that's not a statement of literally what's happening. The sun didn't go, in its path around the earth at the center. That's just a figure of speech. And of course, because we're comfortable with that, that's not a matter of great controversy. It was a matter of great controversy, back in the 1600s. It says the sun rises. It doesn't say the earth rotates. And everywhere you see the sun rise, if you took that literally, it would imply that the earth is the center of the universe. Again, we're used to this. Well, of course, that's metaphorical. But of course, it raises the question, what is there now in these debates? So there's a big fight, today over in some circles about taking the Bible literally. There are things that a literalist on, say, for example, 24-hour days, that say, well, it says day, we need to take that as a literal day, and yet why don't you take the sun stood still literally? You see what I'm saying? There's an inconsistency here, where it boils down to what our culture and tradition is comfortable with. And so our culture is comfortable with taking sunrise as a metaphor. But many people are not comfortable with taking the days of Genesis as metaphorical. And it's not a matter of whether or not you believe in the Bible. It's a question of what is the best way to take the Bible? What is the best interpretation of this? So with Galileo, I would say, as it usually is, the debate wasn't really about even the Bible. The debate wasn't really about truth. I think that the Galileo debate was much more, as it usually is, about uh, upsetting tradition, upsetting assumptions. You're messing with my assumptions about things. You're messing with my traditions. You're messing with the status quo. I felt secure. You're messing with my security. I felt secure with the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, and now you're throwing everything up in the air, Galileo. And it's also about power. We're the church. I'm the Pope. Who are you to think that you could come up with something, that you didn't clear with me first? I'm the Pope. And so, as it often is, these issues are really more about power and security than about the truth. I think this is often the case in these sorts of religious debates, that it's rarely really about just the truth. It's usually more about power and tradition. In terms of tradition, Galileo's ways challenged Aristotle, and Aristotle was the bomb. Everybody thought Aristotle, he's the man. And it's not just Catholics. I think we should notice that Melanchthon in the Lutheran tradition strongly opposed Galileo as well. Aristotle was loved by both Catholics and Protestants at this time, and Galileo's ways challenged the prevailing paradigm that was Aristotelian. And so he challenged the prevailing power-laden traditions of that particular day. Of course, in terms of the church, Galileo was seen to violate rules that the Pope had laid down for him. And in fact, they condemned him in 1633. The Pope had said, okay, well, you can continue to do your research and you can continue to publish things as long as you don't act like you're right, as long as it's just speculative, okay? Well, maybe this could be. As long as you do that, the Pope said you could do it. But of course, when Galileo actually published his work, the position that was most representative of the Pope was espoused by a character in his story called Simplicius. Well, I'm sure the Pope didn't like being thought of as simple. And so Galileo got in big trouble. He was not burned at the stake, but he was put under house arrest basically for the rest of his life and forbidden from publishing everything. He did, but he snuck it out. Okay. So the Bible really was more of a pawn in a larger political game, as it often is. I think the Bible often is the presenting symptom of debate, but really there are usually deeper things going on. That the debates over verses in the Bible are usually what we might call epiphenomenon of more fundamental issues of power and tradition. Okay, so a little bit about Galileo. One of the interesting things that comes out of this period is a change in the way even Christians think about the difference between the natural and the supernatural. So this distinction between the natural and the supernatural simply did not exist before Copernicus, because for example, Martin Luther had a different, even though Luther and say Sir Isaac Newton, even though they both believed in God, their conceptions of God in relation to the world, even within that 100-year period, were quite different. So for Luther, the world was full of spirits, and there was a chain of being, and God was involved in everything. You might know that Luther felt a call to become a monk in a thunderstorm, because a thunderstorm for Luther was a spiritual activity. And so, but what happens is the world comes to be seen as a machine that follows certain rules, that God created the universe as this brilliant machine that runs mostly on its own, and that God, after he created it, God is not micromanaging all the aspects of the machine. The machine is a beautiful machine that runs on its own. And so Descartes, who lived in the 1600s, 15 and 1600s, would be an example of somebody who has this position. So for Descartes, you have the mind and the soul, which belong to the supernatural or the spiritual realm. And then you have your body, which is part of the natural realm. And the body follows the rules of nature. And so we are dual. We are body and we're our mind. Galileo put it this way: there is the book of nature, which follows laws, natural laws, and then the book of Scripture, which involves spiritual revelation. This dividing of reality into two different camps, the natural and the supernatural. The supernatural is above nature. It stands outside of the rules of nature. But the nature, we can identify the laws of the machine. We can see how the machine works. We can explore science. Science becomes about, so see this change of thinking. Science becomes a matter of figuring out how God built the machine, rather than looking for, that lightning was God, or Zeus throwing a thunderbolt. Now it's no, lightning is a product of natural laws and natural causes. And then there's God, who is above, who is supernatural. Angels, they are supernatural. The soul is above nature. It's outside of the cause-effect kind of change. In this period, it's no surprise, we have the rise of Calvin and Hobbes, both of which believe that the world is determined. Hobbes believes, people come to believe that the creation is scientifically determined. It's a machine. There's a guy named, it's not Laplace, is it Laplace, who basically says if he knew all the variables, he could predict everything that would happen for the rest of the universe, because to him, it's a machine following laws of physics. And then, of course, then the supernatural is something different. And miracles become something different, as opposed to, and the word miracle is a modern kind of term. So instead of a miracle being just the normal God doing stuff in the world, a miracle becomes God intervening in the machine, God stepping into, we interrupt this normal process of nature for God to do something. A miracle becomes an intervention of the supernatural into the natural. This also opens the door for something called deism. Deists in the 1700s and 1600s were basically people who believe, yes, God created the machine, yes, God created the world, but then he went off to play golf, and God is no longer involved in the world. That's the deist view, as opposed to the theist view. The theist view is that God not only created the world, but that he's still involved with the world. But the deist said, no, God made the world a machine. He created the watch. He's the great watchmaker, but after he created the watch, after he wound it up, now the watch is running on its own, and we don't know where God is. This distinction opened up the door for the rise of deism, which was all the rage in the 1700s in Europe. Well, the next big conflict between science and faith would come in the 1800s with Charles Darwin. Now, before I get to Charles Darwin, I do want to mention a book by William Paley, who was a minister. He wrote a book called Natural Theology that was required reading when Darwin went to university. So Darwin read William Paley's Natural Theology, I think it was called Natural Theology, when he was in university. And Paley makes the argument for design, a teleological argument, that, if you find a watch on an island, you don't think, wow, I wonder, lightning must have struck the sand, and look, it even has the right time. We don't say that. We assume, there must have been someone here before who had this watch. You find a watch, you assume there was a watchmaker. And Paley made the argument, for example, that the eye is a very complex organism, and that therefore you wouldn't assume, wow, this eye is just here by chance. You would assume there must have been a designer who made this eye. It's the argument from design. So that was all the rage in the 1700s when William Paley came up with it. And in the early 1800s, there was similarly a sense that I think most of us, even if you're a young Earth creationist, most of us are comfortable with the idea of extinction, the idea that an animal might have lived, a species might have lived and then died out, and that there would be no more of that species anymore, the dodo bird, and so forth. Well, that was a controversial idea at one point. In the early 1800s, of course, there was the sense that God made every animal after its kind, and that this is a fixed part of the universe. And so there, God made dog, and there is dog. And so the idea that there might have been a kind of dog that existed and then didn't exist, that was controversial. It's hard for us to get back into the mindset of the way people thought. We've already taken on a lot of the science of Darwin and such without even knowing it, probably. But in the beginning of the 1800s, it was discovered, they were discovering some, putting together some bones of things that they didn't see anymore, like the mastodon. The existence of the mastodon was suggested in the early 1800s before Darwin. This was this kind of what I call naughty data, this data that doesn't fit into the prevailing paradigm. Because if animals can go extinct, it raises the question: well, can species come into existence, who hadn't existed before? Again, most people didn't think so. That wasn't the way they looked at things. There was a guy named Lamarck who suggested that giraffes had long necks because generations after generations of shorter necked animals trying to reach the leaves. And that was a very popular theory for some, even after evolution was suggested. Darwin, not everybody went with Darwin's natural selection, the idea that nature selects the fittest and that sort of thing. Not everybody went with him. A lot of people said, okay, well, Darwin has a point, but I go with Lamarck because Lamarck's theory basically said that the intentionality of animals to try to get leaves, that we had free will a little bit, that we could will a change in our genetics and so forth. Of course, they didn't know about genetics at that point. There was, however, again, things that were changing at the time. There was a book by Lyell in the early 1800s called Principles of Geology, in which he argued for what we might call uniformitarianism. This is the idea that things have pretty much been the same over time, and so that if the Grand Canyon looks the way it does, then that would have happened year after year, layer after layer, layer after layer. That was in the water, in geology. Of course, that didn't contradict the idea that God made things after its kind, but the idea of a much older Earth was not particularly controversial, I don't think, among Christians in the early 1800s. And so here's some little developments that probably no one had a big problem with. The idea that the Earth may be a little bit older than 6,000 years, that wasn't immediately rejected in the early 1800s. The idea that animals went extinct raised some eyebrows, but again, didn't seem to be a substantial problem. Of course, the prevailing geological view was not uniformitarianism, but something called catastrophism. This is the idea that we explain the Grand Canyon by the flood, or some that the look of geology can be explained by great catastrophes. And of course, creation science in recent years has revived this idea of catastrophism. I've seen a video on Genesis that basically talks about the kind of Grand Canyon-like cavern in around Mount St. Helens that is less than 50 years old from the volcanic activity of Mount St. Helens. But we have this debate in the early 1800s of uniformitarianism versus catastrophism. So then Darwin, he spends 5 years traveling around on a ship, and he observes variations in finches, and he begins to formulate this idea that certain aspects of species may die out because they do not allow that particular species to have an advantage. So a finch with a particular kind of beak might be able to crack the fruit of a particular island better than somebody with a different kind of beak. And so on this island, we have finches with this kind of beak. And on this island, we have finches with this kind of beak. And this evolution or development Darwin supposed. He extrapolated it and suggested that maybe all complex life forms, including humans, have developed or evolved from simpler life forms because of this natural selection, nature selecting the fittest to survive. Of course, today, even evolutionary biologists might say, well, it's not necessarily the fittest that survive, but those who can adapt the best to a particular kind of environment or are more likely to survive. And of course, scientific creationists today would make a distinction between what we would call microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution refers to kind of this kind of beak changes, or the fact that peppered moths in England, they survived better than the white moths because of the Industrial Revolution and soot in the air. The dark moths could hide better, and so the white moths tended to thin out the population, but the dark moths tended to really multiply because the birds couldn't see them against the sooty trees. That kind of microevolution is usually accepted even by creation scientists. Macroevolution is the idea that we can talk about, bacteria to human being over the long macro scale of time. Well, so what was the reaction to Darwin? I do want to say that sociologically, a lot of times the battle lines become solidified. And when we look back, we assume that it was always clear. But that usually isn't the case, or often isn't the case. When these ideas first come about, there's often a processing time in which battle lines are drawn, and then after the battle lines are drawn, we overwrite our previous memory with certainty. For example, you may know that in the abortion controversy of the 70s, some very key figures in the Southern Baptist Church were not initially opposed to abortion. I think the president of the Southern Baptist Convention is famously there's a famous quote where he is not immediately opposed to abortion. And in fact, some of those early people wanted to make sure, because some of them were racists and some of them didn't want, they wanted an allowance for an abortion in case a white woman was raped by a black man. But by 1980, with Jerry Falwell, it was all very much solidified that if you were a conservative, you were against abortion. And it's been that way ever since. And of course, now there's that initial kind of flux time in the 70s is completely forgotten. Now it's obvious what the position is. And I think with evolution, it was similar, that there was this flex time in the late 1800s where there were Christians trying to ask, can I fit this in to my biblical paradigm, or can I not fit this in? There were things like the gap theory that arose, the idea that in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there might have been the fall of Satan, and that God had to start over, or God started over, with Genesis 1:3 because Satan had messed everything up, and maybe the dinosaurs were in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. You had some of these kinds of theories, but in general, so there was some conflict with a sense of Scripture, and of course, this is how it would be eventually solidified. So after the flux time, when the battle lines get drawn, and the fundamentalists of the 20s and 30s and 40s, when all of that gets sorted out, then it'll be a biblical argument. But it was not necessarily originally just a matter of this goes against the Bible. I think, and again, that's an important point to realize, that a lot of times we use biblical arguments as a kind of front. It's the upfront argument, but there are often other things going on a deeper kind of level. So, for example, the fact that evolution was loved by atheists was not something that made Christians like it. So the fact that evolution was like, see, we don't need a God here. See, the argument from design doesn't work. The fact that you had atheists promoting evolution is naturally going to lead for Christians to say, well, if the atheists like it, it must be bad. You see how that natural kind of dynamic is going to automatically pit people who love God against it, have a negative feeling toward it, because the people who don't love God, are promoting it. So that's one element in the equation. It also conflicted with the sense of determinism and of God being in control, because evolution seemed to suggest that it's all kind of chance, that there's no purpose to the direction of things, that humans kind of are accidentally here. And so that didn't fit well, especially with the idea, with the kind of determinism of the establishment and so forth. Although there were some Calvinists, B.B. Warfield, for example, who were they processed evolution. They said, okay, I can see this being the way that God directed the process. And so there were some who said, okay, even though it looks like it's nature selecting it, I believe it was God directing it, a kind of theistic evolution perspective, that God directed the process. So B.B. Warfield is a famous Princeton Calvinist who was not as harsh toward evolution as some others were. He tried to figure out, okay, how can I fit this knowledge? Because you see, science had long been considered to be the friend of faith. For Isaac Newton, a lot of the famous scientists of the 16 and 1700s were people of deep faith. And so this was new. The idea that science would be in conflict with faith, that wasn't the way it was. And so this was a new kind of situation. And people like B.B. Warfield, their natural impulse would be, okay, science has come up with some new stuff. It's going to fit with faith. How can I fit it with my faith? And he strategized ways to fit the new science with his faith. There were others who didn't like the theory of evolution because it seemed to imply a lack of human dignity. Humans are just evolved apes. Or we had something called social Darwinism, which is the idea that if I have money, if I'm important in society, if I'm up here, then that must be because I'm one of the fittest, that nature has chosen me, that I am a wonderful person because I have money and power. And therefore, if you're poor, obviously nature didn't select you. If you die, that's no big deal, because this is part of evolution, right? The poor are going to die because they're not as fit as we rich and important and powerful people. And so William Jennings Bryan, who was in the Scopes trial, he argued against evolution in the Scopes trial. Bryan's objections to evolution, because he was I believe, a liberal Democrat. Bryan's objections, and I'm not trying to diss anybody, I'm just saying he was not a social conservative in many respects. Bryan was opposed to evolution largely because he saw it as undermining the love of your neighbor and of treating all humans of equal worth and dignity. And so it was more the social consequence of Darwinism that Bryan was opposed to, rather than the theory itself. And of course, he argued from Scripture very strongly. He argued from Scripture. Well, my intention here in this video has been to give you a little bit of background of the conflict between science and faith. Of course, there are other issues that we will get into as we continue on this journey. But there's a little bit of background that it's a well-worn path that you've probably heard of before. But our goal has been to give a little bit of background to the recent conflicts between science, faith, and Scripture.